Thanks for joining me for our last presentation of this conference. And in this presentation, we're going to talk real practically about things that we can do to assist others as a faith community, as we deal with this pandemic. And so the title of our talk is Learning a New Normal, What Christians Can Do Now. And so let's just get real practical and talk about what we can do to serve and minister others. So what are some of the problems that we're seeing in relationship to COVID-19? The first and obvious would be sickness. Obviously there are people that are getting ill, but we're also seeing a tremendous increase in unemployment. We see a lot of isolation with individuals. We see a lot of fear. We're seeing a lot of financial strain that even goes beyond the unemployment. Just people that are maybe at home. Maybe their salaries have been reduced, things like that. Physical needs, we see people having trouble getting daily necessities. Mental health problems that we've talked about before. Obviously, we're seeing death. We see a number of people that are dying. And then I think there's a lot of spiritual confusion that's occurred within faith communities in the context of what's going on, where is God in this situation, how are we supposed to react, what is going on in the context of this pandemic. So I think all of those are real and reasonable problems that we are running into in the context of this pandemic. I also think that every one of those is something that the faith community can step into and really assist people as they kind of make their way through this kind of what a lot of people are referring to as a new normal. I don't really like that term because I don't like the pandemic to dictate to us what is going to be normal. I think we should dictate what's going to be normal. So we're going to come up with how we're going to deal with the pandemic. We're not going to allow the pandemic to determine for us how we have to live our lives. So I think as Christians, the first thing we need to do when we're looking at anything from the outside, particularly physical, that's damaging people or we're going to need to minister to people that have been hurt, is we really need to look how God has created us. Because I think we have a tendency as Christians to kind of default to the spiritual. And I think that can be wrong in many instances. I think God has made us more complex than just spiritual. He's made us as a multi-part unity. We have a physical nature, we have a mental aspect to us, we have a spiritual aspect to us, and we have a relational aspect to us. And I see that in the scriptures. If you look at, say, a verse like Mark 12, 30 to 31, where Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy, he says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." He's talking about mental and spiritual and physical and relational aspects of what it is to be human, and we're supposed to love God with all of that. And so that's the full unity of the person. And I think even more so if we look at a verse like Luke 2:52, where it says Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. And there are the four aspects of the human self right there, the physical, mental, spiritual, and relational, as I mentioned. So I think it's very important for us to understand that we are more than spiritual, but we're also more than physical. There are physical aspects to us and non-physical aspects. And when a person is being or is interacting with the environment, he's affected at all levels of that. She's affected at all levels of that. So we have physical needs, we have mental needs, spiritual needs, and relational needs. And the pandemic is going to affect us at all levels of our being. And so as a faith community, we need to be ready to engage people at all of those levels. We aren't just the spiritual default. We can help people with physical issues. We can help people with mental issues. We can help people with relational issues. And in many instances, we find that faith communities are the first place that people go when they're struggling with problems before they go to other parts of the world to get assistance. So let's begin by talking about that physical nature. What are some just simple things that faith communities can do to help people with their physical needs? And I think most faith communities have really already stepped up and are doing a lot of this. So I'm probably just repeating to you what you may already be involved in, but I want to put it all in that broader context of physical, mental, spiritual, and relational. So I want to talk about all those. So one thing we've seen in the context of problems is unemployment and financial strain. So churches can provide benevolence funds for individuals that are struggling to pay bills or to pay rent or pay for medical issues or things like that. So the church can provide some financial assistance. The church can help with isolation. That's a physical issue. We can take advantage of technology. I know most Churches are now being streamed right into your home, so you can watch those Sunday morning, but can develop small groups or Sunday schools, or even offer pastoral counseling and things like that through technology to allow that connection to be maintained and get beyond that isolation. Physical needs, getting access to daily necessities. I mean, churches can have food banks, churches can have clothing drives or clothing donations. And there's a lot of opportunities to offer those kind of physical needs that people need for daily life that a church can do. For death and sickness, the church has already dealt with that for thousands of years. We provide spiritual comfort and care, both to the individual who's ill and to the family that may lose a loved one or have an ill loved one. And then finally, we can directly engage the COVID-19 crisis and really help people deal with their anxiety by giving them something that they can do that can engage this trauma itself. For instance, maybe you can have a mask making drive, or you can set up a testing site at your church. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do that are COVID-19 or pandemic specific that you can do at your or through your faith community that will give people some sense of control and help them kind of understand that we have a role to play and we can help people in the context. And like I said, even doing something simple like making masks can really make a difference for individuals. Plus, it's a great opportunity for people to connect with your faith community. So those physical needs, and there's probably many, many more that I haven't mentioned, many that you may already be involved in, those are extremely important because they give us that connection to people that are hurting, that's suffering. I mean, that we become the hands and feet of Christ, and an opportunity to move on and provide for spiritual needs as well. And I think first and foremost, we need to not forget the gospel. I think one of the things that I've seen, unfortunately, and I see this a lot, anytime there is some type of a trauma or a difficult situation or problems are going awry in society, which is pretty much every day anyway, but just generally, the church tries to look into the scriptures and say, and ask a frightening question, and that is, what does the scripture say about COVID-19? The reality is the scriptures say nothing about COVID-19. The scriptures say a lot of, the scriptures are the story of our redemptive history, how God created us, how we fell away, how he chose a people, brought his son, and brought us back to himself. That's what the scriptures say. If we look in there and try to force our modern day circumstances in there, then we miss the fact that the scriptures tell a story. They tell us the gospel. And the gospel is transformative, and it's powerful, and it's life-changing, and we forget that in the context of the situation we're in. The gospel is as relevant in this moment as it was before. The gospel is as relevant today as it was 5 minutes after it was first told. You don't have to make it relevant. You don't have to put it in the context of COVID-19 to make it relevant. It is relevant. It is life-changing. It is what people need right now more than anything else. And we don't want to get distracted because of all these other circumstances are going on. It's wonderful to make masks. I think that's a great thing. But you make masks to help people be at ease, to give people something that might protect them physically, and to help you build a relationship so you can tell the greatest story that's ever existed so that you can change their life eternally. So let's not forget the gospel. It is the most important thing that we can do spiritually for people, and it's the most powerful thing that we can offer them. And it's really, in some sense, the greatest thing there is. All right, so now there's been a study done at Baylor many years ago, several surveys done of how people perceive God. And looking across faiths, what they found was that individuals perceive God, regardless of your faith tradition, even regardless of whether you believe in God or not, they tend to think of God along two dimensions. One dimension of engagement. He's either more or less engaged in your daily life. And judgment. He's either more judgmental or less judgmental of your behavior. Okay, so you might have a very engaged God who's very judgmental, a very engaged God who's not judgmental, and so forth. And so you've got these two dimensions. And if you lay those two dimensions kind of like this, like a cross, you end up with what a friend of mine who's involved in that study came up with, the four gods. He says basically everyone sees God as one of four images. They see God as the authoritarian God. This is a God who's engaged in world affairs and angry at humanity's sins. So it's a very engaged God, but he's very judgmental. Okay. You see the benevolent God, perhaps. He's engaged in world affairs, but it's less likely to judge. Nonetheless, he has given us absolute standards of right and wrong. So he's very engaged in our lives, but he's less judgmental than the authoritarian God. The third God would be the critical God. He monitors world affairs with a judging eye, but he never intervenes. There's no miracles, there's no thunderbolts of judgment. He is not interested in being involved. And so he judges us, high judgment, but he's unengaged in our daily life, okay? And then there's the distant God. He's essentially this aloof God of deism. He created us and then he kind of went off into the universe somewhere to go do something else. And so he's unengaged, but he's not judgmental. So those are the four gods. Some are highly engaged, some are less engaged, some are highly judgmental, some are less judgmental. But what we find is this. What we find is depending on which God image you hold, it is predictive of the outcome of your mental health. In fact, what we find is that it's the engagement dimension that's most important. So if you are talking to people about God during this pandemic, or if you are trying to grow yourself spiritually during this pandemic, you need to make sure that you are accurate in how you present God to people. Individuals who perceive God as engaged in their life, regardless of the judgment, but if they perceive God as engaged in their life, they report less generalized anxiety. They report less social anxiety, less paranoia, less compulsions, less obsessions. They have less anxiety because they believe God is engaged in their life. And the scriptures are clear that God is engaged in their life. Individuals who believe in a very judgmental God actually go the other way. They show more social anxiety. They have more compulsions. They have greater anxiety. So what I would say is that the scriptures describe to us a benevolent God, a God who is heavily engaged in our daily life, who has a path for us to live, but he isn't overly judgmental. He sent his son to save us from our own sins, from our own wrongdoing. He's made a way for us. And so the reality is that benevolent God is the God that will bring the best mental health to an individual. The worst of the four gods is the critical God, and that's what we find in our research here at the Hope and Healing Center. If an individual believes that God is unengaged in their life but highly judgmental, so God doesn't really care about you and he's punishing you with the pandemic, that mental health outcomes for that individual are horrible. And so we need to be very careful. So as we minister to people, let's ask them how they perceive God. Do you believe God is engaged in your daily life? Do you believe God is very judgmental? Let's get a sense of how they see God so that we can make sure they understand the true character of God. And a lot of times that just gets back to the gospel as we help explain to them what God has done for us. Another aspect of the spiritual needs of people is how they cope religiously. We've talked about coping in some of our other discussions, but there's religious coping as well, and there's positive religious coping and negative religious coping. And as we've said before, positive coping is very beneficial, and it builds you up, and it makes you more mentally well. And negative coping might make you feel better in the moment, but long-term has negative consequences. And so positive religious coping, these are the things you want to look for in an individual to see if they are coping with the situation from a positive religious perspective. They're looking for a stronger connection for God in the situation. They're seeking God's love and care. They're seeking God help in letting go of anger. They're trying to put plans in action together with God in a partnership. They're trying to see how God might be trying to strengthen them in this situation. They're asking for forgiveness, and they're focused on religion to stop worrying about the problem. So they might pray when they're anxious to kind of help with the anxiety. So that's all positive religious coping. It's all builds an individual up. It causes more mental wellness. If an individual is expressing those things, then you can look at that person as having a positive outlook religiously in the context of, say, COVID-19. Negative religious coping would look like this. They're wondering whether God's abandoned them. They feel punished by God for a lack of devotion. They wonder what they did for God to punish them. They're questioning God's love. They're wondering whether the church has abandoned them. They've decided that the devil made all of this happen, or the demonic, and they're questioning God's power or his omnipotence. And so you can see the very much difference between positive and negative coping. So if a person is saying things to you like, I think God is punishing us because of the pandemic. I think that maybe God really isn't in control. Maybe this is outside of his control, or maybe the devil has taken over. The devil made me get coronavirus. Why is God punishing my family? Why did my wife get sick? What did I do? Did I not love him enough? Did I not do my spiritual disciplines enough? Those are negative religious coping approaches, and those will lead to greater mental unwellness or illness. And so that individual is going to be less likely to deal with the situation. Plus, it's also going to destroy their spiritual life. And so you need to look, as a minister of the gospel, you need to look at an individual and say, how are they coping with this religiously? Is it positive or negative? If it's negative, you need to begin to turn that more positively. If it's positive, you need to affirm that more. So again, as you look at a person from a spiritual perspective, start with the gospel. Even if they've already come to know God in a saving with a saving faith, they need to hear that story again. It's the most important story we will ever tell and will ever hear, and we have to be reminded of it. The gospel is our beginning. We then need to look at, how do they perceive God? Is he engaged? What is his character? How do they see God? Do they see him as critical, unengaged, and judgmental? If they don't see God as that benevolent God who's engaged and finding a way for us to be in relationship with him, then we need to begin to turn them back to the true character of God. And then also religious coping. How are they coping with this situation? Are they doing it in a positive way or a negative way? Again, if it's negative, we begin to turn it back towards a more positive approach. So those are things that we can do from a spiritual perspective. So we've talked about physical issues. We've talked about some spiritual issues now. Let's talk about some mental health issues. So we all have mental needs. And so as people are struggling with trauma in the context of COVID-19, one of the things that a church can do, and I'm going to give you a website at the end here where you can go and get this, you can offer some support groups. So here at the Hope and Healing Center, we have a wonderful support group curricula that we've developed called Hearts Transformed. It's for people who have suffered some type of trauma. It doesn't matter what type of trauma, it's for general trauma. Originally developed it when I was working in Libya with civilians that had been exposed to combat, but it's used with women that have been the victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. It's used with combat veterans. It's been used with child soldiers. It's been used with a wide variety. It's been used with earthquake victims in Haiti. It's been used with Syrian refugees in Europe. A wide range of people who have been traumatized, and it reduces post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, but it also builds a person up spiritually. So Hearts Transformed, it's a faith-based, very simple. I think it's about 13-week, 1-hour sessions. It's to be led by a layman. You don't have to have any type of mental health training. And we have that available on a website that I'll give you at the end, where you can receive the training online. It's free. It just takes a short period of time to get trained. And then the curricula is right there for you to download, to put in the hands of the people that you're working with. And you're offering a mental health intervention right there at your church that's no cost, that will lower symptoms and build people up spiritually. So you're engaging their mental health needs. And then you can help them determine whether they need to go on to professional care if they need more than a support group. So I think support group is a great opportunity for a faith community to engage an individual from a mental health perspective. And so we've talked about physical, we've talked about spiritual, we've talked about mental health issues now, and there's certainly relational issues that we need to deal with also. And so people are going to struggle with issues in relationship to their family because they've been isolated with one another, and they're trying to deal with that. And certainly a pastoral counseling kind of approach is going to be very effective. We need to be available to people as they struggle through those types of things. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is kind of an ugly thing I've been seeing within the church in general, and that is this idea of kind of, in fact, I'm probably going to upset a few people here, and I apologize for that. And that is kind of connecting on to some of these conspiracy theories that are behind this kind of COVID-19 pandemic. So it's very important relationally for us as a church to be a source of truth and light. We really do not want to get off into a discussion of conspiracy theories and kind of villainizing individuals as this is the person. So for instance, some of the conspiracy theories that I have actually seen, and I've seen Christians promoting these, are that COVID-19 escaped from a Chinese lab. that COVID-19 is really a biological weapon. It's not a naturally developed virus. That Bill Gates and George Soros are somehow behind COVID-19 in an attempt with this globalist agenda. That the 5G cell phone networks are accelerating the spread of COVID-19. And then also that COVID-19 is a leftist hoax to try to bring down President Trump. I have literally seen all of those pushed forward by Christians. In many instances, individuals I actually knew. That's not what the church exists for. And I'm not, personally, I don't believe any of those. I think those are all hoaxes in their own right. But I'm not telling you what to believe or not to believe. What I'm telling you is this: that's not why God brought you into relationship with Him, and that's not why God has put you into a relationship with the members of your fellowship and your church. And it's not why He's going to bring you into connection with others. He has given you and me a ministry of reconciliation. That's what 2 Corinthians 5:18 says, that we have literally been given a ministry of reconciliation. And that does not change because there's a pandemic. It doesn't change because there's an economic downturn. You know, we are not the ministry of pandemics. We are a ministry of reconciliation, because that is our greatest need. Our greatest need is to be reconciled to God. That's the greatest need of all people. And then to grow in the image of Christ as we're sanctified throughout the remainder of our life. So if you look at verses like I've mentioned before, Mark 12, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's our call. That's what Jesus said were the two greatest commandments. Again, not to try to profess to others what the real aspect is behind the coronavirus. And then we look at Matthew 28. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey everything I've commanded you, and surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. Those verses talk about a ministry of reconciliation, a ministry of comforting people, loving people, and drawing those people into relationship with God and the church. And that's where we get back to the gospel. Right now, the only message that we need to be professing to others is the same message that we should have been professing all along, and that is the gospel message, the message of reconciliation. We need to not allow ourselves to be drawn off into these conspiracy theories. We need to be light and truth to the world, because let's say one of these is correct. They're not all correct. They can't all be correct. So at some point, if we're off on these philosophies of man or ideas, and we are found to be in error, then that does not look well upon the church. It does not look well upon us as ministers of reconciliation. But the gospel is true, and the gospel is transformative, and the gospel is life-changing. And so we will never go wrong as we minister to people the gospel. So if you're looking for something to do in the coronavirus pandemic and you just don't know what to do, you don't know how to make a mask, your church doesn't have a food drive, you feel kind of separated from people, connect in some way and share the gospel. Get online, get in a chat room, call a friend, pray for people. Be involved in the message of reconciliation, the ministry of reconciliation that God's given us, because that indeed is what we're supposed to do. And when we help people from a physical perspective, we help them from a mental perspective, we help them from a spiritual or relational perspective, we're involved in that ministry of reconciliation, because it's out of relationship that we're able to share the gospel. And it's out of relationship that people then receive the gospel. So God has made us as a unity of those various aspects. No one is more important than another. So if we engage a person physically, that gives us an opportunity to reconcile them to Christ. If we engage a person mentally, that gives us an opportunity to reconcile them to Christ. The gospel is relevant in the pandemic today, and it will be relevant in the pandemics to come in the future. So don't minimize its effectiveness and its importance. We have a whole world to share it with, pandemic or not. Thanks for having me. And again, I want to thank Dan and the Hymn Ministries for letting me be involved this year.